Now we're going to talk about something very different, and that's the founding of Charlotte 150 years after Dedham. Charlotte's a very different place, and it's different in all the areas I've talked about: land use, society, religion, and politics too. So let's talk about that and the transitions that have been made from the Puritan world I've just described to this new post-revolutionary world in Vermont. There's Charlotte, and Charlotte's in the Champlain Valley. It's only about 15 miles south of UVM, south of Burlington. It's on Lake Champlain, and it is founded, as I've said before, in the 1780s. And that's a view of Charlotte looking west toward Lake Champlain from the top of Mount Philo, which is in Charlotte. And you can see that it's the Champlain Valley. It's very good farmland. It's very flat for Vermont. It's part of the Champlain Basin, and it's got very good farmland. It's still a little bit of a dairy town. There are a couple of farms left in the town. And here it is on a map of Chittenden County, and you can see it's the southernmost town in the county along the lake. So Charlotte was settled in 1784, and that is late. And you can see up here this is a map of Vermont, a settlement map of Vermont. And the general rule for this thing, I know it's complicated looking, but the general rule is the darker the area, the later the settlement. And you can see that right along the spine of the Green Mountains, right between Camel's Hump and Mount Mansfield, is the latest settlement, as you'd expect. But Charlotte is settled late, not until the 1780s. And considering that by the 1670s, people are leaving eastern Massachusetts and heading into the Connecticut River Valley, it seems odd that it would take another 110 years to settle up in northern Vermont. So what happened? Well, what happened's really simple. Vermont was a dangerous place for English-speaking people to live before the 1780s. We've already talked about the French and Indian War. We've talked about the dangers to the people in the Connecticut River Valley in Massachusetts. And that danger doesn't go away until the English win the French and Indian War, that ends in 1763. There's still another 21 years until Charlotte settled, though. And the question is, what took so long? And the answer is that the danger wasn't gone. Vermont begins to be settled by the 1760s, but the American Revolution's coming by the 1760s, and there's a British Army in Montreal. So when the Revolution breaks out, northern New England, northern Vermont anyway, is abandoned, and people retreat south until the end of the war. And that's why it takes until the 1780s for settlers to come to some of the best farmland in Vermont and settle the Champlain Valley. The Champlain Valley was particularly dangerous during this period because Lake Champlain was the major north-south transportation route for armies trying to invade either north or south. So if you settled in Lake Champlain, there's a good chance some traveling army would come and burn your place out. Here it is. Once it finally begins to be settled, this is the first page of the town records of Charlotte, and this is a map that was made in the 1760s after the town was chartered. It was chartered, that is, the land was surveyed and subdivided in the 1760s, but for the reasons I just told you, nobody settles until the 1780s. And this map tells us a few interesting things. One, it tells us that it wasn't mapped regarding topography at all. Everything's a square little block here. All the blocks are even. There's no accounting for swampland or mountains. And as I just told you, there is a mountain in Charlotte, and there are a couple of big hills too that are unsuitable for settlement. So there's no accounting for any kind of geographical diversity here. No accounting for what's good land and what's bad land. It's just, a straight ruler division of the land. And in fact, as that doesn't necessarily imply, but goes along with that division, Charlotte was not originally settled by the first people who bought it. The people who bought the land were at first land speculators. So there's our first difference from Puritan, Dedham, and Deerfield right away. Rather than being settled by a tightly knit community, people who approach the legislature together, Charlotte's bought and sold by a bunch of land speculators. And here's the other thing the map tells us is very different from these southern New England towns. This is settled in a dispersed pattern from the start. When the people who eventually moved to town buy these lots, let's say they bought lot number 76, that's where you'd go. That would be where your land was. That's where you'd build your farmhouse. So from the beginning, settlement in Charlotte is spread out. There's no intense village. There really is still no single village in Charlotte. They're just trying to develop one now through, land use law. This is a dispersed settlement pattern from the start. Very, very different from southern New England. There's another map of the town, and you can see that the lower right-hand corner there, the very southwestern corner of town, that was set aside for BW, that stands for Benning Wentworth. He's the governor of New Hampshire, who subdivided the place, and he kept a nice little chunk for himself in every town he subdivided. Bennington is named after him. And here's the earliest map of Vermont. This is the Whitelaw map of 1796, and you can see Charlotte there, right along the lake in the lower third. And it's got roads laid out by the 1790, and those roads pretty much correspond to the roads today. They haven't changed much. So this is what we've got as of the 1780s. This divided land doesn't pay a tremendous amount of attention to the geography of the place. And there is the geography. As you look west toward the Lake Champlain, as we saw in a previous slide, the land is flat and it's excellent farmland. As you look east, and this is an eastward view, you see the Green Mountains, and the terrain gets hillier and rougher as you head further west in town. Okay, there is something called the town plot, almost exactly in the center of town. And that would appear at first glance to be just like the village in Dedham or Deerfield, where everybody settles in a tight-knit street and they farm surrounding the village. But that old English pattern of settlement is gone by the 1780s. In fact, this town plot is just another piece of land to be bought and sold by speculators, and there's never a village that develops on it. So this is what the map of the town looks like after all the land has been sold off. And you can see the northeastern part of town, which is in this map the lower right. They had to subdivide that. Those are the less desirable places away from the lake. They had to subdivide that into smaller lots and sell it a second time to be able to unload them all. But that's the town as of the 1790s or so. Very, very different from what we would have seen in Dedham or in Deerfield. The intermediate stage where the land is being consolidated and these individual strips are being consolidated and so forth is over. And we've got basically the modern settlement pattern applied by the 1780s. All right, now let's talk about religion. This is a Charlotte Congregational Church, and that building was built in the 1850s. It's a beautiful Greek Revival building. Bad picture, but a beautiful building. And the Congregational Church is the direct descendant of the Puritan churches of Massachusetts. So the people who settled Charlotte are all New England Yankees. They're all English-speaking. They're all descendants of Puritan families. And they built a church that's a descendant of the Puritan church. And the old lights would become Congregationalists. And everything would seem to be pretty continuous. But if you look at religion more closely, you don't see continuity. You see a distinct break with the pattern of Deerfield and Dedham. Okay, how do we see it? Well, let's look at the members of the church. So here are the first members of the Charlotte Congregational Church, first 20 or so members. And you can see the earliest members joined in 1792 and 1793. That tells us something right away. Puritans who settled Dedham moved there in 1636. They've got a meeting house built and then a minister hired by 1638, within 2 years. Charlotte's first settled in 1784, and here it is 1792. It's almost 8 years after settlement when they finally form a church. Here are the first members of that church in 1792. And another interesting thing we can see from this list is that there's a majority women. This is a post-Great Awakening church. So all of the changes I talked about regarding the Great Awakening and how the Awakening appeals to women and changes the moral authority of the family and so forth, you can see in this a church where this majority female, and a church that isn't formed immediately after the formation of the town, but takes almost 8 years to get started. The people who settled Charlotte are not as committed to religion as the people who settled southern New England, even though they're descendants of the people who settled southern New England. And furthermore, it's only got 11 members. There's nothing like the entire community joining the church. In other words, these people don't have that Puritan community anymore. They're no longer visible saints. These just happen to be the individuals who are most religious in town, while in fact the majority of people in town are not joining the church. Very, very different from southern New England. Okay, here is the membership list through 1807. And you can see, again, majority women, and again, not many people, a very slow growth. There's only 25 members, assuming nobody died before 1807, in the Charlotte Congregational Church as of 1807. That's that's 23 years after the settlement of the town. So the growth of the church is very slow, and then here's a clue why. There's no minister before 1807. They don't have enough bodies to hire somebody to be their minister. And that's unimaginable in Puritan Massachusetts, that it would take 23 years to get a minister in town. So very, very, very different pattern of religion in early Charlotte. In fact, these people don't have a church until 1807. They're meeting in each other's homes before then. And it's not until the 1820s that we've got this lively church that begin to dismissing people left and right. That's a minor point, so we'll move on. Okay, this is from the town records in Charlotte. And this is a page in which people go and write down, they all write down the same thing. It's this kind of rote message. And what does it say? Well, here's Caleb Chapel. This is to certify that I do not agree with the Ecclesiastical Congregational Society as it respects religion, dated Charlotte, 16th May, I can't read the date, 1803, I think. Caleb Chapel. And then it's attested by the town clerk in 1805. Here's a closer look at it. What is this? Well, this is the result of a law that passes in Vermont regarding the tax-supported nature of the churches. The churches are public churches in that they're supported by taxes, and you have to pay the tax to support the church. But I believe it's 1801, the state legislature passes a law that says that if you in good conscience cannot agree with the church, you don't have to pay the tax to support it. So this page in the town records that I just showed you is all the people in town who've decided they don't want to pay that tax going to the town clerk to attest that they disagree theologically with the church, with the congregational church in town. Now, do these people have serious theological divisions, disagreements with the congregational church? Maybe, probably. Do some of them just want to not pay their taxes? Well, I think that's an entirely possible thing too. But in any case, again, we have a very, very different thing than Puritan Massachusetts. We have people opting out of church. In addition to these folks who just didn't want to pay the taxes or attend church, there were people who did have serious theological differences and call themselves members of different religions. There is somebody in Charlotte in 1801 who is calling himself a Baptist, and there's somebody who's calling himself a Methodist. Now today, the difference between Baptists and Methodists and Congregationalists, it's mostly a matter of preference. They're not that different. So we don't necessarily see that as incredible diversity today. But in 1800, it was. In New England, the fact that you've got people in 3 or 4 different denominations, you've got all of these non-church goers, much more diverse than Puritan Massachusetts. A big, big change. So all the patterns of religion, despite the apparent continuities, all the patterns of religion are very, very different. Instead of religion being central to the lives of the people who settle Charlotte, it's just an option. The people who like church go to church. The people who don't. One more of these, just another example. But while I've got this, I want to talk about another of the changes in Charlotte, and that has to do with equality. When we talked about Puritan Dedham, I told you that rank was important, and that the early selectmen pretty much told the town what the decisions were, and everybody would have to get in line with that. All of that has changed by the time Charlotte's founded. The American Revolution's been fought, the Great Awakening's happened, society has changed significantly. And no longer is there automatic deference to people who are presumed to be of good family. Rather, the Charlotte, the northern New England, the Vermont of the 1780s is a radically egalitarian society in which status is not granted you upon birth because of your family, but it's claimed. If you work hard, if you make money, if you get yourself an education, if you succeed in life, then you can claim to be a gentleman in a way that you couldn't as a kid. It's something, status in other words, is earned rather than being something you're born with. It's radically different. And the people who live in Charlotte are radically democratic. Their town meetings aren't necessarily the 3 or 4, best men of good family in town kind of dictating to everybody else. Rather, it's a real democratic activity. And the people in Vermont in the 1780s are radical Democrats. And that makes them very different from the early New England. So, to sum up, we have a different society by the 1780s. There's things that haven't changed. Genetically they're the same, right? They're all English-speaking descendants of Puritan settlers in Massachusetts. They're still mostly Congregationalists, those who go to church. They're still farmers. In 150 years, it's possible to look at this landscape and changes from the 1630s and say, oh, things haven't changed that much. It's basically the same society. But again, if you look more closely, you see vast differences in land use settlement patterns, in settlement patterns. You see differences in entrepreneurship. People in Charlotte are much more interested in making money than the people in Dedham necessarily were. You see differences in politics. You see differences in religion. We've got a transformed post-revolutionary society in Charlotte, Vermont, one that we can no longer call Puritan. Now we can call them old-fashioned, post-revolutionary, or new-fashioned, post-revolutionary Yankees, fiercely egalitarian and fiercely independent.